Hello my brand new A2s, welcome to your first video. I'm sure you're thrilled to be watching this as A2 students. We are going to go through your exam that you did before the summer. There were some real concerns for me. As always, it was a huge mix, and every single person had some questions they did well on and some questions they didn't do so well on, but there were some quite serious concerns about the essay questions for me, so that is something we're going to focus on throughout this year. It's also something that I would highly recommend that you tailor your individual personal revision to. So we're going to go through, when we get into the routine of it, we're going to have an essay question plan every lesson. So you're going to plan an essay question every lesson for me. My advice would be that you then at home write an essay for me and I bring it in for me to mark. And then at the end of the exam season you have, at the start of the exam season, you have all of the example essays with feedback from every single one. I cannot recommend that enough. The number of you that probably dropped a grade or even 2 grades because your essay writing wasn't quite there was a little bit worrying. So please, that would be my key focus for the session. Also, hopefully you'll understand now why I kept going on about the way I did, about the things that I did, the words that I did, the terms I did, the questions, the underlining. For those of you who did that, I saw a big kind of gap. You achieved much more highly than maybe the students who either hadn't always paid attention in session to those things or just completely forgot about them in the exam. So again, another thing to practice. Okay, so explain the function of the endocrine system. Generally fairly well done, particularly examples, however maybe not the kind of definition bit at the start. So you get 2 marks for explaining what it is and 2 marks for an example. So 1 mark if you mention secreting hormones and ideally mentioning regulating the body's functions. 1 mark for mentioning in some way the bloodstream, because it's the endocrine system. If you think about the other system we look at, the nervous system, that's electrical impulses. 1 mark for identifying a gland and 1 mark for telling me what that gland does in relation to the endocrine system. Now, if you listed 1 or you listed 100 glands, you wouldn't get more than 2 marks. It's 1 mark for a gland or identifying as many glands as you can, but it's still 1 mark, so just identify 1, and 1 mark for telling me what they do. You also needed to mention the hormones and the bloodstream. Please can you look at your exam paper, look at that question, and then annotate that question. Add anything in that you haven't got. If you haven't got full marks, explain why you haven't. Which of the following, this is a horrible one, at first I was kind of like, why is everyone not getting this right? It's quite clear, but then when you read both questions I can understand why you find that tricky, but it's really important to pick out. So which of the following is not a feature of the cognitive approach? And then you had to fill in the sentence. Internal processes are studied, and then you need to think which of these is not a feature, so basically which is not true. Using computer models. So internal mental processes are studied using computer models. Well, you know, the multi-store model, the working memory model, all of those are computer models. Input, output, sensory input, encoding, retrieval, all computer words. So that one's true, therefore not the correct answer. Internal mental processes are studied using direct observation. We cannot directly observe an internal mental process, as you know, because they're an internal in your mind. They're a thought process. We cannot directly observe them. Therefore, no, that is the correct one because it is false. It is not a true statement, and they ask for which is not a feature of the cognitive approach. Using inference, so they're studied using inference. It's the only way you can't even observe, the only way to observe, to study internal mental processes is using inference. So that statement's correct and therefore not the right one. And using theoretical models, the ABC model. So you did know all of those. Okay, so it's the only one that wasn't true. So just read that carefully. Briefly outline 1 limitation of the cognitive approach in psychology for 1 mark. You could have said issues with extrapolation or issues with interference. It said in the mark scheme, do not accept statements such as it ignores X approach. That on its own is not enough. So you need, if you were going to use that one, you'd need to talk a little bit more about it. But I would recommend instead issues with extrapolation or issues with inference. So issues with extrapolation was in spec as E because it's cognitive, it's computer models, but also issues with inference because you might have been able to work out we're inferring something, we're not directly observing it, and some of you use that one, which was absolutely fine too. Using your knowledge of the 3 features of the social learning explanation of behaviour to explain JAMIL'S behaviour. The structuring of this almost without fail, was very, very poor, okay? You kind of went into essay writing sort of features. That's not what it's asking for. Use your knowledge of 3 features. The minute it says 3 features, you look at the marks. There's 6 marks, 2 marks for one feature, 2 marks for another feature, 2 marks for another feature. Okay? So what you would do is you would name, explain, and then apply. So it's 1 1 mark and 1 A2 mark for 3 features. So you need to name it, you need to explain what that means, that will get you 1 mark, and then you need to apply it, that will get you your 2nd mark. Just describing social learning theory without making it clear does not get you the marks. You need to structure it like that. So please think carefully about the structure. I denied over a lot of you about the marks for this. You must make the structure clear. So you get 1 mark for accurate knowledge. Do not credit just naming the feature. And there are all the ones you could have named. People were good at naming them, they weren't good at explaining them. And then, so yeah, name, explain and apply. So there we go. There's an example of full marks. 1 feature of social learning theory is imitation. This means copying someone's behaviour. For example, Jamil washes his toy cars, copying his brother's behaviour. 1 mark, 2 marks. Name, explain, 1 mark, apply, 2 mark. The 2nd mark. Another feature is modelling. This is where someone displays a behaviour which can then be copied. For example, Jamil's brother washing the car. Identification is also a feature where someone is influenced by a feature that the role model has, which makes it more likely to imitate them. So, you know about identification. For example, Jamil and Sahab are brothers, so Jamil will be influenced by this. They are also both male. Okay, and then you've got vicarious reinforcement, and you could have used role mediational process and even broken the role mediational process down, but you must read the question carefully. I was a bit worried by the structuring of these, so remember this type of question and absorb this type of structuring. Not planned. The question was describe and evaluate the biological approach for 12 marks. We're going to talk about 16 markers because now you're in the 2nd year, it's 16 markers. The information is basically the same. It's the level of depth you went into. I was really worried about this one. Very, very few people got over 1 or 2 marks. So I was really concerned by this. And I'm quite interested to know, so I'd like you to think while you're marking your exam paper, what happened, what was the block, think about it in all 3 scenarios. Think about what happened in the lessons. So why was there an area there which stopped you from accessing the information, and how could you have got around that? Think about your revision. Was there an issue with your something about your revision? Was this an area that you neglected? Or think about why that was and how you can avoid that for 2nd year. And then thirdly, think about actually in the exam, was it a timing issue? It could be all 3 of those, it could just be 1 of them, it could be 2 of them. So was it a timing issue? Did you not leave enough time? So I was really worried by this one, and I will be asking people about this one as well, because I was really concerned. Okay, so I want to know what happened, or what you think might have happened, and what you're going to do differently. So things you could have talked about, genes and genome and phenotype, and lots of you talked about that. Evolution, we didn't really link it back to the biological approach. That's the key thing. You need to link it back. Biological structures, so the nervous system and the brain and how they influence psychological behaviour. Remember we talked about psychological behaviour. Neurochemistry, neurotransmitters and hormones. You know about those already from Andy and myself. You've already learned about those. Okay, and then supporting evidence, you got Nastrat and Billet, which hopefully you know from 2 places. You know from here, and you know from psychopathology for OCD. I'm trying to make your life as easy as possible. Practical applications, SSRIs, you all know about those because we did them in so much detail. Evaluation of methods you use, lab studies and brain scans. You can talk about how good they are. They're very scientific, they're very controlled. Problems with twin studies. A lot of you referred to the idea that actually identical twins are probably treated more similarly than non-identical twins. So that's a problem because we're making the assumption that they all had the very same environment. And then you had loads of contrast to alternatives. It doesn't consider nurture as much. The diathesis stress model might be more effective. It ignores the idea of free will, and it's reductionist. So any of those, okay, so I want you to have a think. On this slide, was there particular things you didn't write about, and why didn't you write about them, and what would you do differently next time? How would you deal with that? In the real exam, I don't want people getting 1 and 2 marks for essays. That's very, very scary. So we need to think about why that happened and how we can change that and move that forward for the 2nd year. outline 2 definitions of abnormality. So you could have had deviation from social norms. I think generally people did well on this one, which was good. Hopefully you can all see now why I asked you to do it in the intervention sessions every hour you worked on one of these definitions of abnormality. So deviation from social norms, different from expected behaviour produced by other members of the same group, unexpected behaviour that offends in some way, or failure to function adequately. So abnormality is judged by inability to deal with everyday demands. It's maladaptive, so adaptive behaviour means it helps us, maladaptive means it doesn't help us, irrational or dangerous, and it causes distress to themselves or to others, as you know. What I would say is, I think the easiest thing to do would be define it for one sentence and give an example. That would be your second sentence. So I'd go define example, define example. Statistical infrequency, the behaviour is abnormal, it's numerically rare, and that's really important. Numerically, you must mention numerically. Characteristics of the behaviour are less common and typical, and two standard deviations away from the mean at least. And then deviation from ideal mental health, absences of signs of mental health abnormality. So we look at what ideal mental health is, and then if you are missing some of those ideal mental health characteristics, then you would be considered abnormal. Failure to meet Jehoda's criteria. As you know, there they are listed. I wouldn't mention them all for 2 marks. I would go with the top one and then an example, although I suppose the criteria would fall into example. And the more criteria someone fails to meet, the more abnormal they are as well. This one was answered really, really poorly again, and it's quite a simple one. It could have up to, in the second year paper, there were 2 marks. It was 4 marks altogether, so just make sure that you're prepared for this one. These are easy, so easy information that just requires you remembering it, so it's on you in your revision. So think about why that happened. Remember, we had the tables. You could cut the tables up, and every time you've got 5 minutes, just reorder them into order, anything like that. Just think of a simple way. On Quizlet, have them on Quizlet. The most important thing I saw here was cognitive. Give 2 cognitive characteristics. So things that we think, not things that we do or things that we feel. Do is behavioural, feel is emotional, cognitive characteristics. And we've got obsessive thoughts, which should be really easy now that you see them to connect them, because thoughts, internal mental processes, cognitive approach, and selective attention, so they can only focus on one particular thing. So again, another one really high up on the list to think of an easy way to evaluate them, because I think they'll be back next year or the end of this year. What's a matched pairs design? Terrifyingly, you all knew this, but you just didn't quite answer the question in such a way to get the second mark. So make sure that you think carefully about what you're saying. Think about it step by step. Imagine giving those instructions to someone who's never done it and then doing it and see what they get. So everybody was able to tell me they were matched according to a variable, which could be confounding. So a variable that could cause a problem in the study. 1 mark. If that's all you do, you've just got 2 people matched together, and then they happily leave knowing that somebody else likes reading fictional books as much as they do, or has the same math score as them. What you need to say then to get the second mark is, going the wrong way. Each person from a pair goes into a different condition. One person does condition A, one person does condition B. Okay, that bit's really important. That's how you get the second mark. Look at your answer. If you haven't told me that, that's why you've only got 1 mark. How is using a matched pairs design an improvement? It will reduce possible effects of participant variables or individual differences. Identify one other variable on which the clients must be matched in this study. If you mentioned the IV itself, then that's not. So if you just said the IV, that's why you didn't get any marks, because we don't match just on the IV. We don't match on the IV. That's it. Might match. Well, I'll show you the answers and you can see. Severity of OCD would be 1. Type of OCD would be 1. Satisfaction with life rating before therapy would be 1. References to other therapies they might be taking, drugs, have they had therapy before? So I had some really good suggestions there. Mostly it was really strong. So there are some of the suggestions, okay? What do the median values in Table 1 suggest? So this is one that we're going to be, a type of structure we'll be working on. So the quicker you pick this up, the quicker I'll leave you alone about this one. The clients and participants were well matched at the start of the study, as their median satisfaction scores were similar before they experienced their courses. So that's one thing you could have talked about. They talked about a 0.5 difference. At no point did they just restate the numbers, because that doesn't tell you anything. You've got to tell me a bit more about them. So you get 1 mark for saying they were well matched, and you get a 2nd mark for telling me how we know that, because the rating scores were similar. So well matched, 1 mark, rating scores similar, 2nd mark. Therapy B is a more successful course of therapy, 1 mark, as final ratings increased more for B than for A. Therapy B is more successful, 1 mark. How do we know this? Because there was an increase, a bigger increase for therapy B than therapy A, 2 marks. Okay? What do we know? How do we know this? What do the scores tell us? Why did... yeah, so that's it. So what do we know? Successfully, B was more successful than A. How do we know this? There was an increase in scores, not just restating them. Both therapies were successful, 1 mark, as the ratings at the end of the course were both higher than before, the before ratings. Okay, so again, another one. Both therapies were successful. 1, how do we know this? The ratings were higher for both therapies at the end. 2nd mark. Everyone was matched, so this had no impact on the findings, as it was controlled in each condition. So a lot of people talked about matching therapies, matching people is a good thing to do. No, matched pairs, you match them together and then you forget all about that, because you just know that they've been matched. So other variables won't affect their results. So in the results, when you're talking about the median, it's not really relevant how they're matched. Okay, matching has no effect on the therapy. It's not, matching people doesn't make the therapy better or worse. We match them, so then we don't need to think, well, is it how severe their OCD is, or whether they've had other therapy. All of those variables are controlled for, and then we know it's only the type of therapy that's having an effect on their OCD. Okay, and nothing else. So if you said, oh, well, it shows that matching is a good thing to do, that is not the correct answer. We're focusing here on the therapies. What does it tell us about the therapies? Collecting qualitative data in this study might have been more useful of a way of assessing the effectiveness of the 2 therapies. I was so thrilled. I'm pretty sure most people contextualised, which was fantastic. I was really pleased. If you didn't link to the study, you didn't get any marks. Unless I was feeling really generous, you might have got 1, but mostly I think I said no marks. Can you all check you've done this? Can you underline where your direct link to the study? So where you've mentioned the therapy, where you've mentioned something about the study in any way whatsoever, can you underline it? If you have, you should have got 2 marks, unless you weren't quite in enough detail, but you've guaranteed you've not got no marks, if that makes sense. A strength of qualitative data is it allows the clients to fully express their reasons for their therapy ratings. This is a strength because the researchers can be more sure their conclusions about the therapy are valid and reliable. Explain why, structure it like a P paragraph. A strength is, this is a strength because. Explain why, evaluation, P paragraph, but smaller, only 2 sentences because it's only 2 marks. Okay. Describe and evaluate the 2-process model as an explanation of phobias. It was slightly better than the biological approach, but still didn't blow me away. Okay. So you could talk about how the 2-process model explains how a phobia is developed. You can talk about classical conditioning and how that is acquisition, and operant conditioning and how that is maintenance. You could mention negative reinforcement and give examples as well. Okay. You could also talk about stimulus generalization, but you don't have to. So we talked about that, the idea that it's not the particular dog that bit them that then is the only stimulus for their fear. It's all dogs. So it's not just one little breed of Chihuahua. If the Chihuahua bit them, it generalizes to all breeds of dog, or maybe all breeds of small dog. Practical application, systematic desensitization of flooding. You should have known about that one because you should know, because it could have been a 12 marker on its own. Issues and debates, it's quite a reductionist concept, and you can talk about WALP and oh no, that would be systematic desensitization. It ignores biological preparedness, so the idea that we're more likely to develop a fear of a stimulus which is more likely to harm us. Contrast to alternatives, again you could talk about biological preparedness there, so it ignores that. And supporting evidence, little Albert, and you all know about little Albert. Okay, so that's the structure for the 8 marker. And then the research methods section, okay. Underlining, I saw some people doing this, I saw some people, the ones who did it did better than the ones that did not do it. If you did not underline, even if you did really well, you could have done even better. So well done for doing well, but you could have done even better. If you didn't do as well as you hoped, maybe this is your downfall. So if you haven't underlined the stimulus, if you didn't do it in the exam and annotate it, or you only did it half, you just underlined it, I'd like you all to annotate it now. When I speak to you about your exams, I'm going to, again, another thing I'll ask to have a quick look at is your stimulus, and I want you to have underlined as much as you possibly can and annotated it, okay? So pause there. I've got the answers. So pause there, and underline and annotate it, and then check your answers, okay? So pause. So the method was a lab. The IV was the same location, a different location. The DV, number of words recalled, so operationalised. Design, repeated measures. Sample, 20 people. We don't know how it was sampled. Controls, counterbalancing, and completed on the same day. Okay, so just check that you've got that as well. So identify, and then you can see already why this makes so much sense and why it's so easy. Almost all of you identify the type of experiment correctly. You didn't talk about experimental design in the type of experiment. You didn't talk about experimental method in the experimental design. If you did, I mention this every single week for many, many weeks. I need you to think about why you didn't pick up on this. What is it, something that you're doing in session? Okay, so I need you to think carefully. Are you not listening? Is there another reason maybe why you're not picking up on that? Because I mentioned it so much because it was something I was so worried about, okay? And now you can see why, because they almost purposely try and trick you up. So I want you to think about, if you didn't get this one right, when I speak to you, I'll be asking you what you think it was that happened that you didn't, and what you're going to do differently to make sure you pick up those things. If it's making notes, whatever it might be. So B was lab, and F was repeated measures. Repeated measures in experimental design. Lab is an experimental method or type of experiment. Okay. Identify the operationalised variable. So 2 marks for an operationalised dependent variable, the number or amount of words correctly recalled. 1 mark for just saying it. So correct words or number of words. It's got to be number or amount of words recalled correctly, which you know. So there are lots of different ways that you could randomise. Pick one. If you picked one and you only got 2 out of 3, find your one on here and add in how you could have got that 3rd mark. Or if you didn't have anything, pick one of these that you like and make notes on this one. So all of them, you put the 50 words into a container or you number them, and then in one you draw out a list. 1 for A and 1 for B, 1 for A and 1 for B, and stop when there are 2 lists of 25 words. So that's really important. Read again, it talks about 50 words altogether. Or draw out 25 words for list A, 25 words for list B. So you may find that you didn't get the marks because you talked about draw out a list of 50 words. It's not 50 words, it's 25. Okay. Or computer method, number all of the words, get the computer to randomly allocate 2 sets of 25 words, and then convert the numbers back to words. I think you could also do that where the words aren't numbered, you just have the words at random in a computer, but you still need to explain the same process. Explain the benefit of using randomisation for this study. So no links to the study, no marks. Can you underline your direct reference to the study? If you can't do that, that's why you didn't get the marks. If you can feel confident that you're able to go on to get the other marks if the information is correct. Again, explain, well, it says explain, but the benefit, so therefore it's clearly evaluation, so benefits evaluation. A strength of randomisation is it eliminates investigator bias. One word list could not be made to be easier or harder than the other when the lists are constructed. This is a strength because it increases the validity. The psychologist can be confident it's the location affecting recall and not the difficulty or the ease of words. So the first bit is investigator bias or validity, and then you contextualise it to the study. One list of words, or it can be confident it's the location affecting recall. Explain how the words that were used to make the two lists should be matched in order to improve the study. So this was a bit weird. Explain how, step by step. So not explain why, explain how. So the process. So lots of you explained why it was important, but no one explained, well, less of you explained in enough detail for 2 marks. Explain how, step by step. Explain why, so go and circle all the explain whys for me, please. Evaluation, so and put AO3 next to them, so if you can do that. Explain how, step by step guide, 2 marks, 2 steps. Words would be chosen and matched having an equal same length of difficulty as the others. So number of words, number of syllables, number of letters, type of word, which lots of you suggested, which was really good. Each word in list A should have a comparable or matched word in list B. So what you're matching them on, how you're going to match them. And the second bit's dead easy, you're just going to match them together. You know, you're matching list A and list B. All right. What conclusions might be drawn from the data in Table 2 refer to the mean and standard deviation. So again, the structuring is what's it telling us and why. Apologies, got interrupted there. So I think what I was just saying was that you would say, what does the data tell us? How do we know this? So the mean tells us this. We know this because the mean is higher or lower. The standard deviation tells us this. We know this because the standard deviation is bigger or smaller. So on this one, what does the mean tell us? We know this because. What does the standard deviation tell us? We know this because. So if you want to pause there, can you look, have you done that type of structuring? If you haven't, you need to remember to, okay? The mean tells us participants' memory worsen when learning and recall locations do not match, 1 mark. How do we know this? We know this because the mean is higher in the same location condition than the different location condition. The standard deviation tells us the spread of performance is consistent or similar in condition 1 and 2. How do we know this? Because the standard deviation is very similar for both conditions. So they haven't repeated the words, they have, the numbers from the table, they've told us similar or different, higher or lower, that kind of thing. Okay. No marks for just stating the figures in the table, which is what I'm saying. Don't just repeat the figures, say whether it's higher, lower, smaller, bigger, similar, different. Okay. Given the information above, explain why it was more appropriate to use the standard deviation rather than the range. The standard deviation is not easily distorted by extreme scores, and then it says, given the information above, such as the anomalous score in condition 1. Standard deviation takes into account the distance of each score from the mean, not take the distance between the highest and not just taking the distance between the highest and the lowest. So it's each score, and it uses every piece of data or value collected. Okay, these kind of questions do come up, so do make sure you're ready for them. They're one of the first things you looked at with Andy, so go back to your books to have a look at that. And we've now covered standard deviation in our homework, the summer task as well. Name an appropriate graph that could be used to display the means shown in Table 2, so just the means. Suggest appropriate X and Y axis labels. So you'd say bar chart, same location and different location, mean number of words recalled. So you must contextualize. You can't put condition 1 and condition 2. You know you can't do that. We talk about that a lot. So same location and different location, mean number of words recalled. They all gave their consent, so you can't talk about consent. Identify one other ethical issue that should have been addressed. So you identify it for 1 mark, explain why it should have been addressed, so explain why for 2 marks, and how it could have been addressed for the 3 marks. Okay, so identify why it's addressed, how it could have been dealt with. Okay, so 1 mark, you name it. 1 mark, you explain why. For example, my example is confidentiality. So confidentiality, respect, protection from harm, right to withdraw, privacy, any of those, yes. Consent, no, because it's mentioned above. Explain why, for example, and the example I've used is confidentiality, so that people cannot be identified by their data, as this could be distressing or embarrassing. It could also cause problems with GDPR. Oh, so apologies, the P and the R are the wrong way around. With the GDPR law or legislation. I wouldn't always be expected to know that, but you could mention that. You could talk about it adhering to the British Psychological Guidelines. And 1 mark for explaining how. Use participant numbers, initials, or a pseudonym. Okay, lots of people struggle with the middle one. It's a hard one. Andy and I were saying that in the classroom as well. So it's a really difficult one. So I'd like you to note down either, if you've named another one, not confidentiality, I'd like to note down explaining why that one is important. So for example, protection from harm. They should leave how they arrived, both emotionally and physically. Right to withdraw, you can't retain them because of the BPS guidelines say that you can't. And that's the end of that. Please make sure that you have carefully annotated everything. When I have a one-to-one with you, I will be asking you questions. If your exam is not well annotated, that will ring alarm bells for me, and should for you as well, because it should really, really help you with future assessments and that big future assessment at the end of the summer. Okay, thank you.